Well, Steve Bannon, you know, he's quite a controversial figure, but could he soon end up in a courtroom? It turns out that President Trump's lawyer is threatening to sue the former chief White House official and also sue the publisher of that explosive new book, Fire and Fury, because in that book, Bannon is quoted as attacking the president's inner circle and his family. The legal threat, of course, prompting publishers to release the book ahead of schedule and hoping it goes to the top of the charts. So where does the law stand in this case? Let's bring in our legal panel, Mercedes Cohen, Fox News legal analyst, and Chris Gober, public policy and constitutional attorney. Welcome both. Mercedes, let me start with you. I mean, do you have to show malice? Do you have to show intent? Do you have to show a reckless disregard for the truth, no matter what's in that book?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, first of all, with respect to Steve Bannon, I know there's been some talk about this non-disclosure agreement that he's bound by. That is not the case at all. He's a government employee. He has afforded the protections of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, so he can express his opinions, his thoughts, his observations with obviously very strict exceptions. One, he cannot disclose classified information. But other than that, unless there can be some showing that he libeled and slandered, and you're exactly right with respect to the standard, it is malice, so it is disregard for the truth. He has to show malice in order to come forward for the president to be successful. But it's a very high standard. It's very hard to prove.
But Chris, what about, I mean, he's a former government official, but what about that non-disclosure agreement? I mean, in it, supposedly, it says you're not supposed to disparage, Mr. Trump. You hereby promise and agree not to demean or disparage publicly the company, Mr. Trump, any Trump company, any member, family member, or any family member company. That's in another non-disclosure agreement, apparently from another Trump former campaign advisor. I mean, doesn't that mean that he should zip his lip?
Yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of people don't realize is that non-disclosure agreement also contains that non-disparagement clause that not only protects against disparaging comments against Trump, but also Trump's family members. And that's regardless of whether those disparaging comments are true or false. So, yes, while there are limitations on suing Steve Bannon for comments that he made while he was a White House official, there's certainly an applicability of that non-disclosure agreement to things going back to that campaign and things that he's saying about Trump and his family members during the campaign.
Well, it seems the president is taking it pretty personally. Let me play some of what he said earlier today at Camp David.
So much of it was false. I consider it a work of fiction. And I think it's a disgrace that somebody's able to have something, do something like that. The libel laws are very weak in this country. Just so you know, I never interviewed with him in the White House at all. He was never in the Oval Office. We didn't have an interview.
So, Mercedes, I mean, can the president really sue on this?
I mean, the big issue is going to be this non-disclosure agreement that was brought up just moments ago, because frankly, we don't see that when you're talking about government employees. It flies in the face of transparency, congressional oversight. So that's why these non-disclosure agreements that's being bandied about, whether it's actually something that Steve Bannon would be subject to, is really problematic, because we're talking about a government employee who have to be able to say, if there's something going on, that federal employee, that government employee has to come forward and disclose it. That is their First Amendment right to do so.
Yeah, but it is
definitely going to be a challenge. If you bring it into court, obviously you're asking whether there'll be a success. It's going to be very difficult because you've got the malice that has to be shown, and if you're talking about opinions that Steve Bannon is expressing, those also have protections. That's not defamatory.
And there's the other issue that there are some errors that have been reported on in the book. So, I mean, do small errors, if some people think they're small, does that put the whole book in question, or is it, how does that fit in any possible case, Mercedes?
I mean, that's a great point. Well, simply, it's going to be slice and dicing that book. So where it becomes, it's not going to be whole cloth, oh, here, this entire book is defamatory. No, I mean, when you're talking about defamation cases, it is the statement itself, it's being analyzed one by one.
Chris, let me read you what Mr. Haber, who is Trump's lawyer, says about this. Quote, actual malice, reckless disregard for the truth can be proven by the fact that the book admits in the introduction that it contains untrue statements. Moreover, the book appears to cite to no sources for many of its most damaging statements about Mr. Trump. Also, many of your so-called sources have stated publicly that they never spoke to Mr. Wolf and/or never made the statements that are being attributed to them. Other alleged sources or statements are known to be unreliable and/or strongly biased against Mr. Trump. So you're biased against Mr. Trump. I mean, you got a right to speak out, whether people like it or not.
Yeah, well, I think I get the chest beating by Trump's lawyers, but if I'm Trump's lawyers, I am not bringing a libel lawsuit in this case. There is so much more downside risk to Donald Trump here, because by trying to prove the falsity of these statements, that opens up Steve Bannon to be able to take depositions of Donald Trump's family, requires the Trumps to turn over evidence, and opens up Steve Bannon to file what we call a anti-slap countersuit against Donald Trump that shifts the burden to him and could put Trump on the hook for Steve Bannon's attorney's fees. So while there may be some falsity to this, they are really playing with fire with bringing a lot of libel lawsuit, because that comes with a lot of downside risks.
So, Chris, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, if anything, you're going to have to see the lawsuit really focus on this non-disclosure agreement, this non-disparagement clause. But at the end of the day, I think both parties are going to realize that if this ends up in a lawsuit filings, it's not going to end particularly well for either party.
Mercedes, yes or no? Trial?
No. No,
All right.
I don't. And I think you're exactly right. I don't think that we're ever going to even see a lawsuit. Really.
All right. Well, it's
a lot of smoke.
Selling a lot of books, that's for sure.
That's true.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Eric.